Can following motherly instincts or inspiration change your child's life? We're here to talk about an amazing Old Testament woman who did just this and not only changed her child's life, but the life of an entire nation because of it. So stay tuned.
Welcome to Bible Women in Bathrobes, the podcast where faith meets comfort. Join us Tuesday and Thursday mornings as the gals from Women Warriors of Light and their guests don bathrobes and dive into the inspiring stories of women in the Bible and the teachings of Jesus Christ. From Esther's bravery to the Sermon on the Mount, we explore it all with warmth, laughter, sisterhood, and maybe even a few sleepy-eyed moments. Tune in live or at your leisure as we learn lessons from Scripture which empower women today.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Bible Women in Bathrobes. I'm your host, Tamara K. Anderson, and joining me today are my wonderful co-founder of Women Warriors of Light, Wendi Christensen. Wendi, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And Amy Johnson. Amy, thanks for being here again.
Thanks for having me again.
We are so excited to dive into another story. Last week, we talked about the story of the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. And that story actually feeds into the story that we're going to be talking about today. And this is the story of a woman named Jochebed. And you may or may not recognize that name, but I think you will recognize her more when I say she was Moses's mother. And so we're going to talk about her and some of the inspiration she had and some of the choices that she made that saved Moses and also ended up, which then domino effect ended up saving the Hebrew people, right? So if you want to follow along, we're going to be at the beginning of Exodus chapter 2. And we're going to cover kind of verses 1 through 4 and then verses 8 and 9. And there's a gap in there. And that's the story of Pharaoh's daughter. And we're actually going to cover her next week. Spoiler alert. Okay. So, but today we're going to talk about Jochebed. Okay. So, here's where we start. And we know that that was her name. It doesn't say so in the beginning of this chapter, but it does say so in Exodus chapter 6. It gives us her name and her husband's name. Her husband's name was Amram. And I've kind of written it here in my paper scripture. So just so I remember, these are their names. Okay. And it says in verse 1, and there went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. So going back to last week's story of these midwives, they were supposed to kill these sons. They weren't supposed to be having more sons. The sons were supposed to be killed. So here she has this baby boy. We don't know if she called the midwife or not, but she saw that he was a good child, meaning he was probably a content baby. And we all know content babies are awesome. I had some that were content and some that sure weren't. And so if you're trying to hide a baby in a circumstance like this, it would certainly be easier if they didn't cry a whole bunch. And so Moses was one of those. And I think God knew this is the kind of child he needed to be to fulfill his mission. And so it's interesting that she was blessed to know what to do to save Moses's life. And I'm just going to open that up before we dive into the next step she did to save his life. Motherly intuition, ladies. What are your thoughts? Amy, we'll start with you.
I'm not really sure how to share my thoughts without going into the next verses because I'm kind of that way.
Okay, well, why don't we talk about those next verses? Because this really does follow motherly intuition.
It really is awesome. So yeah.
Such good problem-solving skills here, guys. I'm sure she was inspired. Why don't you read verse 3 there?
Okay, but I'm also going to read verse 22 because of the previous chapter because I think it's really important. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river. And then you go to verse 3, and when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and basically cast him into the river. but in an ark. So she was sort of tricky because she super obeyed, but
Uh-huh.
not really. Do you see? And
Uh-huh.
so, okay, so and daubed it with slime and with pitch and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. I've never really thought of that before today, but because in my brain, after the midwives had, deceived Pharaoh a little bit and saved the children, he commands them to cast them into the river. And so in my brain, I guess my whole life growing up, he told them to drown them in the river because that would be the outcome if you cast a baby into a river, right? But then to see that today, that she actually did cast him in the river. She just put an ark to protect him, which I love that word, ark. I love that word, ark. And as a mother, that is, I think, what my sole desire has been for my children is that some sort of ark would protect them spiritually and physically, but mostly spiritually from the evils of the world. And so she puts him in the river in this ark that protects him from the evil that's going on all around. And I think that's beautiful. I think that's just awesome.
Yeah. That's such a great comparison. I love that comparison of the ark. And it brings even more symbolism since a couple probably spent months ago now, we've talked about Mrs. Noah and the symbolism of the ark and how it protects us and how that can even symbolize Christ, How do we protect our kids? And that's with Jesus, right?
Right.
Teaching them about Jesus. Wendi.
Well, and I can't even imagine, I've shared on previous podcasts of dealing with infertility, but my heart just breaks. Like I couldn't even imagine getting rid of my child, let alone knowing that you would have to put him in the river and just trusting God, because that's really what she had to do. She had to just trust God that I'm going to turn him over to God and he can do what he needs to. I'm obeying the law in a way, she was, but just that she had to have a strong bond, just hiding him for 3 months and making sure he was quiet and he wasn't hurt. And that would just stress me out to make sure that nobody could hear my baby for 3 months. And it doesn't seem like a long time, but it is. And you do a lot of bonding with the baby in those first 3 months, a lot. You get to know them, and understand. She would have had to really know his cry and comfort him quickly, just constantly be there for him to be able to hide him for 3 months. She must have had a really strong bond with him, I would think. For hiding him for 3 months as a newborn, and to just have that huge bond and just put him in an ark, send him off down the river. My heart would be ripped out as a mom. It really would. My heart would be in that basket with him. That had to be so hard for her to do. Like you would have to trust God to do that and just put everything, all your whole heart into trusting him, trusting that God's got him. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more. I'm sure it helped that she understood a few things about Moses, right? We're going to talk about that. So I'm sure that helped her as she put him in that ark, but still, like I said, ripping your heart out as a mom, send your little baby that you have a super strong bond with, that you have protected with all your might for 3 months, and just to send him off and not be quite sure what was going to happen to him.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. And I would almost think that there was probably some requirements for her as a slave that she had to get some work done, and that's probably why she had to do this. Like, dear God, I've got to go and fulfill my job. How do I send my baby in today's language to daycare? But probably worse than daycare, because you don't literally out into the elements, I mean, how can I do these things? How can I do this? And obviously she had her daughter Miriam watch him. That was part of the inspiration, was to put him in, first of all, make the basket, insulate the basket, put your baby in the basket, pray that it will work. I'm sure she tested it out first, but pray that it worked, that he'll be okay, that he'll be safe, that he'll be taken care of while you go off to labor. So hard. So hard. Um, I admire her for trusting God to inspire her to make the right decisions for her child. And I know I've seen that in my own life where sometimes I'm faced with a situation where I can't seem to find, I mean, I can find answers in books or in the internet, but which is the right answer for my kid? Do you know what I mean? Sometimes after reading all these things, I go to God and say, okay, I've got some stuff here. I've got some ideas, but what is right for my child? And waiting and listening. And she didn't have the internet back then. So she had to figure it out without that. And so she really had to say, what is the right solution for my son? And Heavenly Father inspired her. Have you guys ever had a situation where God inspired you to do something for your child when you weren't sure what to do?
What a
Wendy's
blessing
smiling.
that she didn't have the internet, though.
I know, right?
It gets in our way, don't you think?
Yeah, in some ways it sure can. All right, Wendy, you were smiling like you had a story.
Oh, no, I just little things. They're not big things, but even the little things as far as, sending them off to, I remember sending my daughter off to a week-long camp that she didn't really want to go to. She didn't really know anyone, and she was so scared and so nervous to go. And like I said, it wasn't a big thing, but it was to her. It was a big deal to her. And it was really hard. The first night they had to camp out. And the first night they had a major storm, like a huge squall. It happened to be, and it really was a squall that happened with the weather that night. And I remember praying and just like, I hope she's okay. I hope she's okay. And later on, when she came home and shared the story, she wasn't. She was bawling. She was so scared and she was so sad, but trusting God, praying and trusting God. I remember that night just praying for her, and I pray that she'll find comfort and peace. And she did. She was able to find comfort and peace through that night, even though it was a really hard, difficult night for her. But she was able to find some answers and be guided to, they took her they let her go to this other camp where she had a neighbor that was a good friend of hers, and she was able to, commiserate with her and be comforted. And then she's been able to refer back to that time in her life now. It was probably about 4 years ago, with understanding that God knew her because he was able to comfort her that night. And just the beauty of trusting she's going to be okay, and just trusting that God's got her in his hands. And he did. He had her. And now she uses that story to as a faith promoting experience for her, where she sees, oh, that was so hard for me and so scary, but God had me. And I didn't have anyone else around me that I knew, but he led me to comfort. He comforted me. He helped me through that night. And it's such a faith promoting experience for her that I'm so grateful that she had, because when she's having a hard or difficult moment, she can reflect back on that experience and remember that he had her. So yeah. Definitely. Sometimes it is really hard to let our kids have those really tough experiences, to go through those trials and challenges that we see them go through. But we have to trust God that he's going to give them the experiences that they need. And it's not up to us. He needs to, they're his child too. And first and foremost, they're his before they're ours, right? They were given and entrusted to us, but it's really his children, and he gets to be the one that gives them the experiences that they need. And we just have to trust that.
Oh, and that's hard. It is hard, I think, especially as our kids get older and start leaving the house. I remember when my first son left the house, and it was just after he graduated from high school, and he wanted to serve a mission. And, sending them out into the world like that, I was a missionary, but it's totally different perspective as a mom. And as a kid, you're just like, I can do anything, and as a mom, I'm like, did I teach him enough? Do they know enough? Is he going to be okay? Is he going to get the support he needs? And it really is that leap of faith to trust God. Okay, I can't help him every day like I used to. It's now between you and him, and that is a hard thing to do, even if they're going off to do something good, or maybe they're going through something really hard and trusting that God has got them. You know, that story, the prodigal son. Ah, brutal, right? Brutal. So, so hard. Amy, any thoughts on this before we move forward?
I'm sure that she knew that the houses of Pharaoh were downriver. I can't see that she didn't know where he was headed. I and in verse 2, when she said, it says that she saw he was a goodly child. She knew he was strong. Mortality rate for the boys was much higher than for the girls, and so even without the interference of wicked men, um, but she had to know that he was going downriver. And so you think about when you send your children away and they're adults, how scary that is. But yet to send a 3-month-old down the river toward the houses of Pharaoh, not knowing whether his life would be spared, first off. Second of all, if his life was spared, now he's going to be raised in the land of idols. And he won't be worshiping the God you worship. And that's messy. So there's a lot going on here that she just had to say, well, if I continue to hold on to this child, he will be killed because they will find out. But if I send him away, now we maybe have a chance that he can be whatever God needs him to be. And I think that's our job. We need to get out of God's way. That's my point. We need to get out of God's way and send our babies downriver, whatever it looks like. Just get out of God's way.
Oh, so much easier to say than to do. Oh my goodness. Well, let's continue with this story. So Moses was in the ark. Miriam, in verse 4, it says, and his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. I'm sure mom said, please watch him. I want to know the outcome of this, right? And we can't help but touch on the story of what did happen, you know, that Pharaoh's daughter found him. And we'll talk more about that next week. But here's one of the miracles right here, that when Pharaoh's daughter found him, you know, Miriam came and said, would you like me to have someone nurse this baby for you? And she said, yes. And so basically then Jochebed was paid to nurse her own son and raise him to when he was weaned, and then give him back to Pharaoh's daughter. So it was that act of faith. So we'll just read those verses. And verse 9, it says, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, as she said, because I drew him out of the water. So here we have quite the turn of events. And you can imagine Jochebed just being so humbled and thankful. I can now nurse my baby, and not with the fear that he's going to be taken from me, because this woman, who happens to be Pharaoh's daughter, oh my goodness, is going to raise him. But that would be hard too, kind of like Amy was saying. Thoughts here, Amy?
I have a friend who adopted out her first child, and that child was raised in with different beliefs, was still raised Christian, but different beliefs than her other children that came later were raised in. But it has a relationship with that child, and I think that's kind of in this kind of situation with Moses, that's kind of what the best you can hope for, right? Is that child grows up, you still have a relationship when they are grown, and that they believe in Jesus. I think that's the kind of the hope. And so, but in Pharaoh's world, that wasn't really the case.
Yeah.
They really believed in idols.
Yeah.
And in worshiping idols, and that filtered into the civilization of the Israelites, as we see later, that that was what they knew. And so I think for her to not know he was killed, that was probably her best case scenario. And then to know that she could nurture him for the first few years, because back then she probably nursed him till he was 2 or 3, right?
Mm.
That's probably the best she could have hoped for. And I think she would have had to have been so grateful that the best of the worst situation she could have hoped for came to be.
Absolutely. Wendi.
It makes you wonder, like, how much she did know and understand, because I would think that she must have had a lot of faith in God. And it makes me wonder what personal revelation she received about him, and knowing and understanding who he was going to be, and that she got to be a part of, like Amy said, those first few years. I just wonder, what kind of influence did she have on him? Was there, um, you know, things that she, even in those first very few developmental years, an understanding of who he was? She must have had so much faith to just have a connection with God. I would have, asked God, what are they going to do? What are they going to be? You're going to take care of him, and pray for that peace and that comfort and that understanding. And who knows, maybe she knew he would be a deliverer. And that's why she was doing what she was doing, because she felt those impressions and those promptings in her heart to help her to carry on. Because I think as moms, we do have a right to receive, our own promptings, our own spirit telling us what we need to for our kids, and having prompting. I know for me, I've had promptings with my own children of things to do that might help them or guide them. And I'm sure she did. I'm sure she received those personal promptings and revelation that would help her to be able to keep doing what she was doing, and to do what she did in the river, and just realizing and hoping. I just wonder if she knew he was going to deliver her people, and that she just had faith and trust in that.
Yeah. This is such a powerful story. And he must have had enough of a connection with his family. I mean, because he knew Miriam and Aaron, later go down in the story of Moses. So there must have been some connection still with the family. And he must have known she was his mother and that she loved him, and taught him who he really was as a son of God, and that these were his people. But now you have to go. And I don't know, I look at a young child, how much would they understand of that? And did he get to go back and see her at all? I don't know. Do you know what I mean? As a prince of Egypt, I don't know. We don't know a lot of those in between details of Moses's story. But what a blessing that this mother, this Jochebed, by following her motherly intuition, what God was speaking to her heart, was blessed with such a miracle that not only changed her life, but it eventually changed the lives of her entire people. We don't know if she lived to see that. She's not really mentioned much after this story. But what an incredible story it is, right? So, so powerful. All right. Well, let's wrap it up, ladies. Thoughts and takeaways from the story of Jochebed. Wendi, let's start with you.
I think, looking at, again, her faith, that her faith was rewarded by the intervention of Pharaoh's daughter, right? Her faith of, I know my son will be taken care of. She turned her faith over to God. And as I do that in the face of the challenges that I might see with my own children, or if listeners, if they don't have children, just in their own lives, that God is very aware of you, and that your faith does matter, and that you may not see the complete picture of what's happening in your life, but God does. He sees the picture. He sees the direction. He knows what's going to bless you and help you. And if you just put your trust in him, he will take that basket, whatever offering you give, whatever you're giving with your heart, your whole heart, he will take it and he will multiply it and bless it to be in your favor. Whatever it is that you give him.
Yeah. Oh, that's a very good analogy. I like that. Whatever you lay on that sacrificial altar, right? Yeah, because it is. There's always a time when we have to do that. Lay it on the altar. Give it all to God. Amy.
It just occurred to me that she would have known the story that Joseph was raised by the Egyptians and not in his own household, or not raised necessarily, he was an adult, but still lived in that household and stayed true to God. And so I think my takeaways from that are: remember what God does, have the faith to follow him, and stay out of his way. I think those are the things that I just keep thinking. Remember what God does, have faith to follow him, and then stay out of his way. And literally stand still and watch what he does, because he is such a good God. And he really does do great things when we stay out of his way. I've seen that with my own children. The day that I realized that I wasn't going to be the greatest mom, but I was going to be the exact mom that God needed my children to have, for them to have the experiences they needed to have. I could then remember what God does, have faith to do what I believe he wanted me to do, and watch the miracles as I stayed out of his way.
Oh, love that. I think my biggest takeaway is what you said, Amy, is that, she literally put him in this ark, followed her impressions to put him in the ark and to build it the way it needed to be built, and trusted him as he flowed down the river, that God would provide the best solution for her son. And as a mother of now all adults, that is the point I'm at, is trusting that God will provide for my children as I send them down the river. It is an act of faith, right?
Yeah.
Trust that, okay, you've got them for good or bad. You've got them. My influence now is more touch points and love and encouragement and stuff like that. But it is trusting God with those we love, for good or ill. Really and truly, that is, for me, that is that. And it requires such tremendous faith, because I think I used to be much more of a control freak, and I think I still try to control as much as I can. But for me, this has been a new learning experience, sending my kids out into the world.
Tamara, you said something that you said, sending them on their way, trusting God for good or for ill. I guess what I hear really is that we send them on their way, trusting them to whatever good God has in store for them. Because he makes whatever ill we see okay.
Yeah, as it says in Romans, that all things can work together for our good. Right. Yeah, it's true. It's true. And all things can work together for our good. Well, thank you for joining us today and for walking through the story of Jochebed with us. We admire her faith and courage to do what she felt was right, and thus the ripple effect changed the lives of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So stay faithful, my friends.
Thanks for tuning in to Bible, Women, and Bathrobes, hosted by Women Warriors of Light. We've loved exploring the stories of remarkable women or the teachings of the Savior today with you. If today's episode brought someone special to mind, be sure to spread the word, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment of inspiration and sisterhood. Just a friendly reminder, all opinions we share are entirely personal, as we are trying to decipher and apply Bible teachings just like you are. Until next time, stay faithful, and may your journey be blessed and illuminated by God's love.